Does that mean it's well fertilized?
Right.
It probably just more means it's humid and warm.
Humid.
Humid and warm, which they'll like. So, one of the things you can do, just kind of to knock down the population, so you don't get a massive like fly outbreak or
Right.
fly explosion every time you open the grow covers, would just be to uncover it every, when you're cultivating for a while, to like uncover it a little bit every so often while you're here, just so that they get a little bit more airflow.
And definitely cover it back up.
Definitely cover it back up.
Because of the groundhogs.
Groundhogs and the flea beetles, which we luckily have not really seen, I don't think, any examples of yet. But those are another thing that will really kind of go after the members of this family, the brassica family, when they're young. So, but again, this is, I think, like a good example, again, of like the weeding. You can see the first half of this bed that was weeded or cultivated versus these two other beds. These weeds will fill in pretty quickly, and weeds you didn't even really see initially. So this is probably the like weeds that are at this stage. You're getting to the point where you're almost going to be kind of beyond cultivating pretty soon.
So I need to do this.
So you need to do it, within the next couple of days. And especially now that the temperatures are like in the 80s, it can really accelerate weed growth a lot. So getting them when they're young is good. And even if it's like, if you're doing a lot of other things, the kind of most, and you don't have as much time to be spending like hand weeding everything in here, just going through with the process with the hoe and cultivating all of this, and getting as many as you can possibly get through a first pass is gonna buy yourself some time. Yeah. So, yeah.
Why would this one look like that?
Show me which one you're talking about. Oh, that guy. Yeah. So some of it, you can see like how the leaf is kind of like purpling a little bit and it's stunted. Some of that could be that maybe there happens to be like a nutrient deficiency for some reason right there. Other reasons are that maybe it's like not getting enough water or getting too much water or something.
Okay.
That's a good point though. We're gonna notice some variation in the bed in terms of how well different things grow. And our goal over time is to try to be able to standardize the bed so that it's more consistent. When you plant something in one place, you can be kind of guaranteed that it's gonna grow well. Yeah.
What are the two hoes? One of them is the small, what's it called?
Yeah, the collinear hoe.
Collinear, the thumbs up.
Yep.
And then the other one with this almost oblong.
Yeah, the stirrup hoe.
Stirrup hoe.
Yep, stirrup or scuffle hoe. So I would say you could start by using the collinear hoe through here. I think that might be the best. And then if you need it, you could go through with the scuffle.
Okay. Yeah, I know Deontay swears by the scuffle.
Oh yeah.
He swears by that.
I mean, it's a pretty good tool. So also much more affordable. Okay. So today we're going to talk about we're getting to the point in the year where it's time to start planting crops that are really heat-loving. And so a lot of times I'll refer to them, or others will refer to them as either summer crops or warm season crops. And really what we're talking about there are any crops that are frost sensitive. So they'll die if it gets below 32 degrees. And that prefer nighttime temperatures that are above 50 degrees. So usually in this part of Ohio, you don't plant those crops outside until about May 15th or so. So we're just about in the realm of when you would start to plant those crops. And the reason that you would wait until May 15th is because it's kind of considered to be like the frost-free date for the region. So that means it's really unlikely that we get a frost after the 15th of May.
Is it time to remove the big cover
Yeah.
back there?
So that's where we'll go demo this. I'll show you the plots that we did on Wednesday, so you guys can see, and then we could do a couple beds in one of your two plots today as kind of a demo of how to plant the tomatoes and the seed. So a couple other things. So just before we kind of get into talking about the actual planting, I wanted to kind of just go through like some of the examples of those summer crops. So those are listed, I think, in a few of the charts. There's kind of information on preferred temperatures for crops. But can you guys think of some examples of what would be summer crops? Peppers. Yep.
Tomatoes.
Yep.
Well, I mean, it was the deep
Watermelon.
summer, or you mean early summer? Because deep summer is like okra, squash.
Those would all be in the same category of things that will die if it frosts and that prefer nighttime temperatures above 50 degrees. Yep. Some of them like even hotter temperatures, so there is that like secondary class. Carrots are actually a cold season crop. Carrots and beets, they grow perfectly well in cooler temperatures and are very frost tolerant.
So
but you can plant them in the middle of the season.
Oh.
So there are some crops that are more versatile. So you can plant them early in the year, like beginning in April up until August or so, and they'll keep growing until November, even into December in some cases. And then there are some crops that really only do well during the cooler times of year. So those would be things, in general, like lettuce. Lettuce is often a crop that it does best during the cooler times of year. Cabbage would be another example of that.
Garlic.
Garlic is an interesting one because it is a one that you plant in the fall and then harvest the following summer. So it requires this period called, this cold period. They call it vernalization. Vernal, like VERNAL, vernalization. And so it needs that cold period in order to be triggered to develop that garlic bulb. Yep. If you just plant it in the spring, if you like get a bunch of garlic bulbs and plant it in the spring, they won't develop into a bulb. Yeah, they might grow, they just won't develop into that bulb. So that's kind of a special one. But going back to the ones that are, we would consider warm season, meaning they don't grow if it's colder. We talked about tomatoes, Alvin mentioned peppers, melons, summer squash. So anything and winter squash. So both of those kind of categories of squash. The summer squash are any of the ones that have a thinner skin. So like zucchini or like a yellow squash. Like
where does cucumber fall in there? Because I confuse zucchini and cucumber sometimes.
Yep. So cucumber is also another one that is a warm season crop.
Okay.
Yep. It's also very frost sensitive, so you don't want to plant it really before May 15th. Generally here, in some cases you can plant it before May 15th if you use something like a row cover, but you're still row cover doesn't protect against really cold temperatures, so if you got a night that was like 28 or so, your crop could probably still die before that. So generally the advice is to wait until May 15th for any of those crops.
Row cover then is two purposes.
Yeah.
Pest and frost.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
And if you want to cultivate flies.
Yeah. If you're growing a fly operation or the others. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, flies have a purpose too. The larvae.
Yeah, for
I'm talking about for the soil, yeah.
So Other examples, see, I'm just looking at this list. Eggplant would be another example of a warm season crop. Green beans are another example. Green beans are cold sensitive, so they, one, don't grow very fast if it's below 50 at night, but then also they will die if it frosts. So that kind of whole grouping are all ones that you want to wait until at least May 15th to plant. Okay, so then let's see. A couple other kind of qualities of those summer crops that we talked about are compared to some of the other crops that we're growing, like let's say, well, the peas, for example, lettuce. Um, some of these others are what we call quick crops. So they'll mature relatively quickly within a couple months, and then you harvest them pretty quickly, and can turn over that bed into another crop. But a lot of the summer crops that we're talking about, most of them would be kind of a longer season crop. So something like a tomato, for example, it'll keep producing, especially if you're growing varieties that are designed to do that. So there's kind of two different tomato groupings. I'm pretty sure that all the ones we have here are the ones that are called indeterminates. So it means that they'll continue to produce fruit for the whole summer. There's another grouping of tomatoes called determinate tomatoes, and they mostly put on their fruit for about 3 weeks, and then they're done. So these ones here, I think it kind of depends on the purpose for which you're growing tomatoes. Many grow indeterminates if you're selling them kind of fresh to like a farmer's market or a farm stand or something. Sometimes if you have a wholesale account or if you're growing just like a sauce tomato, so something that's kind of better for making sauce, most of those are determinate. But in either case, the determinate tomatoes are still in the bed, so still from planting to final harvest, they're still in for about 3 months at least. So it's a good amount of time compared to something like the lettuce, which you could turn over a bed of lettuce after about 40 days, right? So the lettuce will take, with proper irrigation and the right temperatures, it'll be about 25 to 30 days until it's ready. And then usually you can harvest it for a week, maybe a week and a half, after which point it'll either get kind of too big, or during some times of year it might start to bolt or go to seed. But then you would turn over that bed right after.
That's something you never brought up. Just going to seed. Can you do your own seed? Make your own seed?
Yeah, we are going to have a class just on seed saving to talk a little bit more about that. It's not something we'll probably do so much here, because the kinds of concepts we want to talk about are like learning how to, after this bed is harvested, to then go in and like plant another crop that you can harvest. But a lot of times if someone is trying to do both, if they're trying to like kind of maximize their field and save seeds, they'll do that with the last succession that they have for the year. So like if you planted this bed in peas, you'll harvest the peas, and then in July you plant lettuce. Then you would harvest this lettuce, but then maybe let it also go to seed. Hi, Kenzo. Hi. Then afterward, you might let some of it start to flower and go to seed, and then collect it kind of at the end of the season.
I would like to learn that.
Yeah, so we'll have a full class on
it.
Yeah. Because there's different, like, again, I think we brought this up maybe during the first class. It does depend on the kind of seed that you have, whether or not you can save it.
Do all plants go to seed in some form, or seeds?
Yes,
they should.
But sometimes it takes longer than 1 year.
Okay.
So, like an onion usually will not go to seed in the first year. It's a biannual.
So that's strange. So when you harvest, How do you get to go to seed? You mean you leave some in if you wanted it to go to seed, and let it just pretty much go to death?
Right.
I get it's not really death or whatever.
Yeah, it's almost like, so the onion, the way that the onions will work, they'll be growing until, and continue to grow and grow and grow until about like the middle of July or so, at which point all of the leaves will kind of yellow and die. And the bulb is at that point ready to be harvested. If you just left the bulbs, the onions, in the soil, the next year they would send up a shoot, and that would go to seed pretty quickly. So it's a longer process to do something like that with the onions. Yeah. So
I could remember that maybe the last 20 or something, leave them and let them the next year, or that wouldn't be wise.
Well, again, I think it would depend. When we do that seed saving class, we'll talk a little bit about what kinds of seeds work well for seed saving. Because if it's an onion that is a hybrid, then those don't work as well for seed saving. Okay, so another thing, because a lot of the summer crops that we're planting are in the field for a number of days or for a number of months, they often require more fertilizer than what we initially applied at the beginning. So they'll require some kind of supplemental fertilizer throughout their life. The fertilizer that we're going to be mostly using out here would either will be the fish fertilizer. So it's ground up fish. It smells terrible, but the plants love it. It's mostly nitrogen, and then a little bit of phosphorus and potassium. So it provides kind of an additional boost, a supplement for the plants kind of throughout the year as they're growing.
What about cow, horse?
Oh, yeah. So manure and compost, those kinds of things are generally best used before planting, like we did here with that compost pile. That would be considered kind of an amendment before planting. But something like the fish fertilizer, or even some other forms of like granular fertilizer, a lot of those can be applied kind of to the side of the plant or along the roots when the plant is about usually after like 4 weeks or so.
Is that the same for compost tea?
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
yep.
right. That's enough.
Yeah.
But compost tea, doesn't that come from worm?
It can be from different kinds of compost. So you could make it out of a horse manure compost.
Right.
It's providing both kind of biological. The concept behind it is it's providing both like biological activity. So you're distilling the compost into a liquid form, and then it's like all of those microbes and everything are being deposited into the soil. It's also providing some nutrients, but a lot of it is about kind of stimulating that biological activity. The fish fertilizer is a little bit different in that it's more about kind of like providing food for both the plants, but also for the microbes in the soil in some cases. So it works a little bit differently, but it's pretty similar.
Dead groundhog ground up would be okay.
It might be the local flavor for here. Yeah.
I'm just trying to get a justification to kill it and consider it as being natural.
Yeah. Just I'll put my fingers in my ear.
No, just kidding.
Okay, so so again, warm season crops. That grouping of nightshades, so tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, cucurbits, melons, cucumbers, winter squash, summer squash, okra, beans, things like that. They generally are in the bed for a little bit longer than some of your spring crops, and they often require some kind of supplemental fertilizer throughout the season. So I gave you guys this chart, and if you didn't grab it, it's right on the table in there. But that lists all the crops that we're growing here, and it notes whether or not you'll need to do that. You would need to do a fertilization for it. It also talks about some of the other bed prep. So whether you would plant it in plastic mulch, for example, whether you would use drip or sprinkler systems, and then whether you would need to trellis it as well. We're going to have a class on trellising in about 3 weeks, where we'll be talking about tomato trellising methods and then also cucumber trellising methods. So that should be fun. But know that, like, for many of the summer crops, they require some kind of trellising. Also included on this chart, in addition to those things, there's a few different kind of bed prep options as well, for if you don't want to till. If you want to till, the kind of bed prep can be relatively simple. You're usually just taking out the remains of whatever crop you have in any large remains and then tilling. But if you wanted to kind of take a no-till approach, then you're kind of trying to remove the plant, but then doing either a combination of hoeing, raking, tarping, or using the broad fork, which is over there that we can demo later. Okay.
So side dress fertilization is what you were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. When it says side dress, or sometimes it's called top dress, those are both, like, it's kind of like it sounds. You're like putting a bit of the fertilizer kind of by the side of the plant or over top of the plant.
Feeding it directly almost.
Yeah. But instead of, I guess, the like alternative for amending with compost and mixing that in, that would almost be like a bottom dress or something, right? Because you're kind of like applying it to the root system as opposed to like on the side of the plant. Okay. So now we're going to talk about 2 different methods for planting summer crops. One will be transplanting them into plastic, what's sometimes called as the plasticulture approach. So that can be either the like single-use plastic that you would use, or into this landscape fabric which we can reuse. It can only usually be done for transplanted crops, or it works best at least for transplanted crops. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment. The other option is to plant without plastic and to direct seed. So that would be sometimes works well for things like squash, cucumbers, melons, certainly. Beans would be another example of one that you would do that with. Okra. Those crops will have kind of a slightly different quality maybe to the tomatoes or peppers. So there's reasons why it can be pretty effective to just plant them directly into the bed. Plastic is a resource, right? So we don't want to use it unless we have to. And some crops kind of serve almost to provide their own form of like plastic in some ways too, in terms of how they grow. Okay, so let's kind of pop over here. Elvin, you guys want to do demo and row beds today? The like tomato planting and stuff? Okay, cool. So wanted to just kind of talk about some of the benefits of using plastic mulch or other kinds of mulch when you're planting. So who can think of like some of the benefits for using plastic mulch?
What kind of mulch?
Weed control.
Plastic mulch. Yep. This. Yeah. So weed control or any kind of mulch actually that would apply to. The weed control, right? So just like our tarp, the landscape fabric blocks light coming through. It does allow rainwater, but it blocks light. So any weeds that would maybe start to germinate under there won't have any light, and so they'll die the same way that they do under the tarp.
Does suffocation do that too? Is it kind of suffocating the weeds too? Not really.
It's not in that they. So a plant, like, whereas we would need oxygen, a plant would need carbon dioxide, right? And it's probably lower levels of carbon dioxide under the tarp than above the tarp. But I think the most limiting factor for the plants is probably the fact that they don't have any sunlight. Yeah. Okay, so weed control is a good one. What are some other reasons why we might want to use plastic mulch or some kind of mulch?
Does it help retain the soil?
Yeah. So like, do you mean like the soil, like
erosion? Yeah.
erosion? Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't actually thought about that as a benefit, but it definitely does do that. In the same way that the tarp does, it's kind of preventing, maybe you can kind of see it in this bed, there's like a little bit of, kind of the soil is, in this case I think we were stepping on the side there and it was kind of muddy. But the soil, can kind of, on a heavy rainfall or something, can run off the bed. The plastic tarp helps to kind of provide that cover and spread out. Because it's this big surface area, any impact is not going to take a little particle of soil with the water that would run off. It's going to kind of spread it out over this area. Related to that, the plastic mulch also helps to provide a moisture barrier a little bit. So while water does get through here, it doesn't evaporate at the same rate that it would in an open bare bed. So you're helping to kind of conserve water by using some kind of mulch, whether it's plastic or straw.
Now with these, so basically that stays through the whole life of the plant.
Yep, exactly.
Onions, though,
same thing.
Same thing.
Yep.
The whole life of the plant.
Whenever we use the landscape fabric, it stays for the whole life of the plant. Whenever we use the tarps, it's a pre-planting method.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. So yeah, the plastic is here as long as the crop is here, and it's able to be reused year after year for the same crop. Because you've already cut the holes, you're kind of locking it into one system, but it's able to be reused again and again. What about some other benefits? You guys?
It looks cooler. Aesthetic.
It can be kind of nice aesthetically. It's a little cleaner, I guess, in some cases. What about okay, so when we just opened up that row cover, it was kind of warm and humid and everything like that underneath. The landscape fabric, in part because it's black, provides even more kind of warming of the soil, which again, especially in the springtime, right now for the next few weeks, that can be really helpful to just encourage the plant to grow a little bit more. So warming the soil, especially early in the season, it's very helpful with the onions in particular for that reason, because those are planted when it's colder. Okay. I think one other thing that could be attributed to having some kind of mulch is that, especially with the plastic mulch, they can help with pest control a little bit. So a lot of pests will start their life or will pupate in the soil. So they'll go from egg to that larval stage in the soil, and then they'll pupate out of that larval stage and come up out of the soil and start to eat your plant. So if you have kind of a bit more of the soil covered, it makes it less hospitable for some of that egg laying to occur. So that can be helpful for some types of pests. It's not helpful kind of across the board for all pests, but it can be helpful for some.
There's something I noticed. When you pull things up, you don't see what is it? I don't know if worms is the right term. Like if it's wood, remember you said the wood would attract slugs?
Yeah.
Plastic doesn't, I guess.
It can, but I think it gets warm enough under there that the slugs don't like that.
But wood,
Yeah, the slugs kind of like a slightly cooler but wet environment. So they might like that more in the spring when it's warming it to a degree where they're it's more comfortable for them.
right.
But at this time of year, after 90-degree days or 85-degree days, they will not want to be around it. you normally do see a good amount of worms. Like this kind of parking can stimulate a good amount of worm activity too. So wouldn't be surprised to see kind of more worms.
Though, right?
Yep.
Worms are good.
Yeah, worms are a good thing. Okay, so this is the plastic mulch system or plasticulture system. One thing you probably notice on this bed, there's an irrigation underneath, like we talked about with the onions. While water does get through here, you really do need to install some kind of irrigation. A lot of times what will happen, especially if it's a harder rain, is a lot of the water will just run off the bed. Because this is kind of semi-porous, the surface tension will kind of draw the water just off the bed. Or off the plastic. So you do need some kind of irrigation source going under the plastic for the plant. Some people have put it on top, but you kind of run into the same issue as with the rain where it will kind of beat off the plastic.
This only has one line. What's planted here, or it hasn't been planted?
So this was seeded. This is kind of the next crop we're going to talk about. This was seeded with squash. So,
it didn't need to be really leaf level.
Well, that's a good observation about the bed. Although it could probably be improved a little bit.
Okay, I didn't know. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't be critical. I didn't know if it's like, for example, that didn't match.
Well, so I guess before we kind of move on from plasticulture, so the process would just be, laying your drip tape first. Generally, for most of the warm season crops, we're talking about using one drip tape. But there is that one of the handouts in class kind of had those different bed spacing options. That handout is really helpful. It'll tell you kind of like how many drip tapes you would need for different crops. In this case, for most of them, you'll probably just use one drip line. Install the plastic over that, and then burn or cut holes and put the plants in. One thing I will say, this is not, they didn't do this wrong, but the tomato plants are a little bit more zigzaggy than you really need them to
I
be.
thought you needed that. That's what I was thinking because of the drip tape down the middle.
Yeah. So ideally, the tomatoes would pretty much be in a straight line in the middle.
Oh, so they must have thought that it was supposed to be the drip tape in between.
What we talked about when we were burning the holes for this is to go slightly off center of the drip tape so that you don't hit the drip tape when you're burning the holes.
Oh, and they took it as being on all.
And they went a little far on the outside. It's still okay and within the realm of something that is workable. But when we start to talk about trellising, you'll kind of see a little bit more why it's nice to have them in a straight line instead of in a kind of wider line. So,
So it should all be on one side of the drip tape.
it can be on either side, but usually you can kind of burn the holes straight down the middle and then just move the drip tape as you go. It's nice to have them on either side because it kind of cinches the drip tape in place. Versus if they're all on one side, the drip tape can kind of like wander. It'll move once it fills with water, so it can kind of move to the other side of the bed.
See, I thought that was a good idea, so it's not.
In this case again, because of the trellising method, trellising is the support system that will have to keep these tomatoes upright.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh.
So you're putting one trellis, or could you do like a wider trellis?
Yeah, you could do a wider trellis here. It might require the system we're going to talk about using, which is kind of good for rows this length would be a T-post method, and stringing trellis twine so that the plants, as they grow up, there will be T-posts every 8 feet along the bed, and then there's trellis twine on either side of the plants, and it's kind of cinching the plant upright. So the plant, there's a trellis twine on one side, the trellis twine on the other side, and the plant is right in the middle. So if the plants are kind of wider apart, it's harder to kind of cinch them together. That being said, we could just do 2 T-posts on either side and make a little bit more of a box potentially. It's just more kind of more T-posts. So again, we'll talk more about trellising in a couple weeks. But just as a note about this, I think if we were to do it again, probably keep the plants more in one line. Okay, so here is kind of the other option for how to put in some of these summer crops. And this would be just kind of a bare bed. So there's no plastic mulch that's going to be used on this. And it's a direct seeded crop. So they seeded in here 2 different kinds of summer squash. They seeded, I think, a zucchini and then a patty pan. One that looks like this. Yeah, it looks like a starship or a spaceship. Yeah. Yeah, so just another kind of summer squash. So in this case, we uncovered the tarp and they hoed the bed so that like there are kind of some of those like ghost weeds like over there. They hoed those out of the bed, kind of pulled out if there were any other weeds that were coming up. They pulled those out, and then planted right the drip line, turned the drip line on, and then planted along the drip line where the holes were at the correct spacing.
So this is hand planted.
Hand planted, yep. And exactly, yeah. And the reason we will do that, and it's still relatively kind of efficient way to do it, is because of the spacing of these plants.
Right,
Yeah, yeah. So like remember like with the beets or the peas or something like that, we use the cedar. And that was because there's a lot of seeds per bed. In this case, the seeds are spaced out a lot more, so it takes like 5 minutes to seed this thing, right? Because you're planting, in the case of summer squash, every 3 feet. So it's really far apart. Yep. So in this case, the kind of disadvantage compared to the plastic mulch is that we don't have that weed barrier over it. So all of the rest of the bed, is while the plants are growing, could potentially, you can see a lot of weeds in there, right? But the reason that we do this method, especially for some kinds of crops, is that they are pretty quick growing. So they'll form that kind of canopy over the soil relatively quickly. And they also have almost like a kind of like umbrella shape to their leaves. So they'll, again, like shade out any other plants in the process. So have you guys seen like a summer squash plant all before? Maybe yes. Some yeses, some no's.
But I didn't know it was called summer squash.
Yeah. Yeah. They'll push out to be about like 3 feet or so in diameter. Like really like this big.
I thought it was squash.
Yeah. It can be susceptible to some pests and some other, kind of. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it does. It gets that downy mildew at times, especially if you kind of have a wetter year. It'll do that. So one of the things that that can help with that, at least kind of initially, is to make sure to give them more space, that 3-foot spacing, so that the plants aren't kind of crowded together. And then kind of often after a while, it succumbs to the mildew at some point, especially for organic production. So in this case, though, like that kind of umbrella shapes the leaves, the fact that it'll get so big and bush out so much, means that it's kind of serving as a natural weed barrier. So it's doing a good job of shading out a lot of those potential competitors. You do have to, over the first like probably 3 weeks or so, give it a little bit of. You'll need to cultivate probably once to twice, depending on the weed pressure in the bed. But then after that point, usually the plants are growing pretty quick.
I guess, yeah, by the time you see the plants come up, because you cultivate now, I'd be scared of it.
Nope. And remember when we talked about the right stage to cultivate your plant, do you guys remember kind of how big the plant should be? Yeah, so you want, actually even a little bit smaller than that. You just want to make sure that you can see them and that they're probably like about like an inch and a half or 2 inches. So in this case, yeah, let me just get an eye out here. The good news is, you kind of have a rough sense that like everything was planted along the drip line. So you'd probably be safe to plant it along the path. But ideally, with the way that we prepare these beds by putting on the tarp, that should buy them a couple weeks of not having any weed pressure. So that's kind of the idea with tarping, removing the tarp and then planting. Okay. So let's hop on over here and do a couple demos of our own. Drier as it goes up that way. So what we found with like the tomatoes, for example, we brought forth on their bed of tomatoes before planting, and we were able to do about the first 3/4 or so of the bed, and then this last section here got a little too wet. Yeah. So the ideal kind of texture is that it's not you're not like able to form the ribbon like this, meaning that it's pretty like well saturated. So like in this case, I can kind of form that like that ribbon of mud, of clay. What you want is a little bit more of a crumblier texture, so that the holes that this is opening up, the space that it's opening up under the soil, is actually going to like stay opened up. So in this case, you would go kind of, again, like go backwards down the bed and do this down the bed, and then could rake over it afterward if needed, or like in this case, it's not really, I didn't really change too much, so then I could just plant right into it. Yeah. So that's the broad fork. Because these are slightly older seed. They're from 2019. We'll plant 2 seeds per hole that we'll make. The reason we do that is because we want this bed to be full, so we'll err on the side of overseeding a little bit, and then can always kind of thin out the plants afterward. So cucumbers there's 2 different approaches actually. You can plant 2 rows of cucumbers per bed and space them out at like this, and have 2 feet in between on this side, but then the other one is kind of in the middle, like that. Or you can just plant 2 feet apart along the drip line and have 1 line. So in this case, we'll do 2 feet apart along the drip line and just do 1 single line.
Sure, go ahead. I just asked, is there a reason you don't use the weed barrier?
Yeah, so in this case, cucumbers you can use the weed barrier for them, and for you guys, because you're going to have transplants of cucumbers, that would be something that you could use. It's hard to direct seed using the weed barrier because sometimes if like the seed gets buried or doesn't get enough water or whatnot, it can often kind of get like covered by the weed barrier when it's really small. So generally you like to put in plants that are a little bit bigger like this, so that they're less likely to be covered by the weed barrier if there's wind or something like that. So that's one reason why we would use the non-weed barrier in this bed. The other reason is that cucumbers will kind of branch out really quickly and will cover this and kind of serve as their own weed barrier really quickly. So they work pretty well kind of by themselves to serve as a weed barrier. Okay, so if we're planting every 2 feet, we've turned on the drip tape so that we have this guide here for us. And the drips, you can see the holes are every 6 inches.
Yes.
So that means that we'll put 2 cucumbers. I just kind of made like a small hole using my finger, put 2 cucumber seeds in it, covered it up. And then go 1
Go to
foot,
the-
2 foot,
Oh, okay. At the drip. At the drip.
right at the drip.
That's what.
That's the most important. Yep. So you see, like, you can either kind of make a hole and pop them in, or in this case, I just take the 2 seeds and just push them in the ground and then cover them like that. For the tomato planting, because we can't see the drip tape, we need like a guide to be able to help us determine the spacing. So in this case, I have a piece of drip tape. That's 1, 2, 3. That's 2 feet. That's an extra inch, so just cut it a little bit. And so this will be our guide that we'll use as we're planting to make sure that we have the correct spacing. We will want to start out so we know that there's a slit here. So then in 2 feet, there should be another slit right here. So because I don't want to put a tomato right at the end here because the weed barrier is not going to do anything for it. I'm going to go to the next slit, which should be right here. And our torch kind of bit the dust, so we're going to use.
Oh wow.
We're just going to use some pliers to be able to, or some landscape pruning shears to be able to cut a hole. And we can just cut a slit like this for the tomatoes. So if I was doing this kind of as a part of like on a farm where I was planting a lot of tomatoes, then I would have one person who's doing all the hole cutting, so who's going ahead and doing all the hole cutting for the bed, and then I would come back through and have my plants next to me and be planting my plants. So I'll just cut a couple holes right now, just as kind of a demo, and then we can do the rest of the bed. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how I'm using this tool, we cut our first slit right here.
About the midway of the hole to the next.
This is 2 feet.
Okay.
This is the spacing that you want for your tomatoes. So I'm just going to use this to mark out every 2 feet. And I've already lined this up with the drip, so the drip is right there. So I know that every 2 feet there will be another drip. Okay, so here are our tomato plants. These were some that were donated to us from another farm in the area that had some extras. They're a bit leggy. What that means when we say leggy is that they're pretty tall.
Okay.
So that's not necessarily a desirable quality for plants, because it also means they're less stable. So like if a wind comes around, it might be more likely to kind of like whack the plant and break it. So it's not as desirable. It does happen often to tomatoes, especially if they've been a little bit too long in the tray, and they really start kind of reaching for light. The good news is for tomatoes is that this can be kind of easily remedied. Tomatoes are a plant that will produce new roots off of their stem, so you can bury them relatively deeply, and all of that stem there will produce roots, so it'll all root out. So in this case, you'll want to bury to the first set of leaves. So here, that's about right here. So we're going to bury it up to right here. So about 2 inches, okay? And the way that I do that is, actually, Alvin, would you mind hanging on? I think it's slightly electrical.
I was going to say, it looked a little bit more.
You don't, the reason I kind of erred on the small side here is because the purpose of the weed barrier is to be a weed barrier. If I start cutting really big holes in it, then I'm defeating the purpose of using the weed barrier. This soil is nice and soft enough that I can kind of use my hands to dig a hole. So look, I've kind of dug out a little bit of a hole here, just like that. And then I can go ahead and pop that plant in there, and then kind of fill in up to about that one plant there.
Now it does look sturdy.
So it's got a little bit more kind of support there still bounces around a little bit, but again, these guys are pretty resilient. So I've seen a tomato plant come back from a lot worse. The tomato to be like stocky. Yeah. I mean, that's going to result in a tomato that's going to have, it's going to grow and start to produce quicker because it's kind of gone through less shock. But the difference would maybe be in this case a couple days. So that's about it. We have done the whole We could have. It just kind of depends. Like sometimes it's easier to just mark them as you go along. Yep. Yourself in a situation where you have a lot of root-bound tomatoes or any kind of transplanted crop, you can kind of just like smoosh up the roots a little bit at the bottom. This will break them a little bit and encourage them to grow. If you just plant a root-bound crop outside, it'll just like keep growing roots in that area. Yep. So, yeah. So that would be kind of what you do for a root-bound crop. This one I say it's not necessary. So. Okay. And that's tomato planting. Yep. I'll plan on going today with Thursday. I will.